Daniel Morgan's body betrayed him with every stride of the horse beneath him. The gelding's gait, normally smooth enough for a Virginia frontiersman who'd spent half his life in the saddle, now felt like hammer blows against the base of his spine. Each jolt sent white fire through joints swollen with arthritis, the kind of pain that made a man's teeth grind without permission. 44 years old, and he could barely sit upright. His left leg had gone numb an hour ago, the sciatica transforming the limb into dead weight that threatened to slide from the stirrup. Behind him stretched a ragged column of men who called themselves an army. Continental regulars marched with the disciplined step of professional soldiers, their blue coats faded to gray, their muskets held at the prescribed angle. Then came the militia, farmers and shopkeepers who'd left their plows and counters to carry hunting rifles through the Carolina winter. They walked in loose groups, talking among themselves, glancing over their shoulders at the road behind. Always behind, because somewhere back there, perhaps 20 miles, perhaps less, rode the man who'd turned the southern colonies into a charnel house. Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton, Bloody Ban, the Butcher, a 26-year-old cavalry commander whose green coat had become synonymous with terror across Georgia and the Carolinas. Morgan had never met him, but he'd seen what Tarleton left behind. The bodies at Waxhaws still haunted the nightmares of every militiaman in his column. 113 Americans cut down while trying to surrender, their white flags ignored. Their pleas for quarter answered with sabers and bayonets. The survivors spoke of British soldiers bayoneting wounded men where they lay, of cavalry riding down those who fled, of blood turning the red clay to mud. Tarleton's quarter. That's what men called it now when they meant no mercy at all. Morgan shifted his weight, trying to ease the pressure on his lower back, and felt something pop in his hip. The sound was audible, sharp. His aide, a young lieutenant named Anderson, glanced over with poorly concealed worry. The cold helped, at least. January in South Carolina brought frost to the grass at dawn, turned breath to fog, numbed fingers on musket stocks. But cold also stiffened joints already screaming with inflammation, made old wounds ache with renewed vigor. The scars on Morgan's back, 499 of them from a British lash 2 decades past, pulled tight across his shoulders like cords under tension. He'd been 20 years old when a redcoat officer ordered him flogged for striking a superior. The regulations called for 500 lashes, enough to kill most men. They'd stopped at 499 as a joke. One lash short of death, one lash short of mercy. He'd counted every stroke, made himself count, made himself remember. The British thought discipline meant fear, that breaking a man's body would break his spirit. They'd been wrong about him then. He hoped to God they were wrong about him now. The year 1780 had devoured American hopes in the South like wildfire through dry timber. Charleston, the jewel of South Carolina, had fallen in May after a siege that ended with 5,000 Continental soldiers marching into British captivity. Savannah remained firmly in enemy hands, its port feeding British ships, its warehouses provisioning British armies. When General Horatio Gates had finally gathered enough force to challenge Lord Cornwallis at Camden in August, the result had been catastrophic. Gates himself had fled the battlefield, riding 180 miles in 3 days, moving faster than his own retreating army. The militia under his command had broken at the first British volley, running before the enemy even closed to bayonet range. The Continentals who held their ground were slaughtered. Cornwallis had written to London after Camden that the rebellion in the South was effectively over. The proclamation wasn't empty boasting. British regulars now controlled 90% of Georgia and South Carolina. Loyalist militias emerged in every county, settling old scores under the protection of the crown, burning the homes of patriots, driving families into the woods. The war had become something uglier than a fight for independence. It had become neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother, a civil war within a revolution. Then Nathaniel Greene arrived. Washington had sent his most trusted general south to rebuild what Gates had destroyed. Greene was a Rhode Island Quaker who'd been expelled from his meeting for taking up arms, a man who combined deep strategic thinking with an understanding that conventional European tactics had no place in the American wilderness. He'd surveyed the wreckage of the Southern Army, studied the maps, calculated the odds, and made a decision that violated every principle of military science. He divided his forces. Every manual, every textbook, every veteran officer knew you never split your army in the face of a superior enemy. It invited defeat in detail, allowed the enemy to destroy your separated elements one at a time. But Greene saw something the manuals didn't account for. If he divided his forces, Cornwallis would have to divide his own to pursue both columns. And a divided British army meant weaker detachments, longer supply lines, more opportunities for the kind of quick strikes and retreats that American forces could execute better than their European-trained opponents. Greene took the main force east, toward the coast, drawing Cornwallis after him. He sent Morgan west with roughly 1,000 men, militia and Continentals mixed, with orders to harass British outposts, gather supplies, and most importantly, force Cornwallis to detach troops to deal with the threat. Cornwallis had taken the bait. He'd sent Tarleton. Morgan heard the scout before he saw him, hoofbeats drumming hard along the frozen road. The rider materialized from the gray afternoon light, his horse lathered despite the cold, foam white against its neck. The man's face carried the tight expression of someone delivering news he wished he didn't have to share. The words came out between gasping breaths. Tarleton's force had been spotted 15 miles south, moving fast. Mixed cavalry and infantry, the green-coated British Legion that formed Tarleton's personal command, supported by elements of the 7th Royal Fusiliers and the 71st Highland Regiment, perhaps 1,100 men in total. They were marching through the night, pushing hard to close the distance. Morgan dismissed the scout and sat motionless in his saddle, feeling the weight of the information settle over him like a physical thing. 15 miles. At the pace Tarleton's Legion moved, that meant contact tomorrow, maybe tonight if the British commander was particularly aggressive, and everything Morgan knew about Bloody Ban suggested he would be. The broad river lay ahead, perhaps 5 miles distant. If Morgan pushed his men hard, they could cross before dawn, put that natural barrier between themselves and pursuit. The water ran deep this time of year, swift with winter runoff from the mountains. Tarleton would have to find a ford, slow his advance, give Morgan time to widen the gap. It was the tactically sound decision, the choice any reasonable commander would make. But Morgan had spent the last 3 weeks retreating. His men were exhausted, their shoes worn through, their rations depleted to hardtack and whatever they could forage. The militia, already suspicious of the Continental Army's ability to protect them, had begun deserting in small groups. Every morning brought empty bedrolls, men who'd slipped away in the darkness to return to farms and families. If he retreated again, if he ran from Tarleton yet another time, there might not be an army left to command, and Greene needed time. The main force was being pursued by Cornwallis himself, buying space through a fighting withdrawal that required both American columns to stay active, to keep the British divided and off balance. If Morgan's force dissolved through desertion, or if Tarleton destroyed it in detail, Cornwallis could concentrate his entire army against Greene. The Southern campaign would collapse. The Revolution would die in the Carolinas, while the northern states watched, helpless to intervene across hundreds of miles of British-controlled territory. Morgan called his officers to him. They gathered in a small clearing just off the road, their breath fogging in the cold, their faces showing the accumulated fatigue of weeks spent running. Major John Eager Howard commanded the Continental Regulars, 300 men from Maryland and Delaware, who'd proven themselves in the northern campaigns. Colonel Andrew Pickens led the more experienced militia, tough Presbyterian fighters who knew the backcountry and had learned to stand under fire. Lieutenant Colonel William Washington, a distant cousin of the commander-in-chief, controlled the cavalry, 80 dragoons mounted on whatever horses they could scrounge. These were good men, competent officers who'd earned their positions through demonstrated courage rather than purchased commissions or political connections. Morgan trusted them, which was more than he could say for half the generals he'd served under during 6 years of war. The words came hard. His throat felt tight, the old flogging scars pulling across his back as he straightened in the saddle to address them. The broad river lay ahead, safety, but he wasn't going to cross it. He was going to turn and fight, here in the Carolina backcountry, with a river at his back that would cut off any possibility of retreat. Howard's face went carefully blank. The expression of a subordinate hearing orders he profoundly disagreed with, but knew better than to question openly. Pickens looked at Morgan as if reassessing whether the old wagoner had finally cracked under the pressure. Only Washington seemed interested rather than horrified, his head tilting slightly as he waited for the rest of the plan. Morgan laid it out. Not the full strategy, not yet, but enough to explain why he wasn't running anymore. Tarleton had won every engagement he'd fought in the South. 15 straight victories, each one reinforcing the myth of British invincibility, each one driving more Americans to either switch sides or give up entirely. That myth had to be broken, not just defeated, but shattered so completely that men across the South would know the British could be beaten, could be destroyed. And Tarleton's weakness, the flaw that ran through every one of his victories, was his own success. He'd become overconfident, contemptuous of American fighting abilities, certain that any show of force would send militia running and leave Continental regulars isolated and overwhelmed. Bloody Band had fought the same battle 15 times, won it 15 times, and now he thought it was the only battle that existed. Morgan intended to show him different. The officers dispersed to prepare their men, doubt written in the set of their shoulders. Only Howard lingered, moving his horse close enough for private conversation. His voice dropped low, meant only for Morgan's ears. The question came direct, stripped of military courtesy. What if the militia broke? What if they ran the way militia always ran when faced with British regulars in cold steel? Morgan felt the pain in his back flare as he twisted to meet Howard's eyes. The younger man needed to understand this wasn't desperation or madness, that there was method behind what looked like suicide. His words came quiet but absolute. The militia would run. He was counting on it. The trick was making their retreat part of the plan instead of a disaster, turning their natural instincts into a weapon instead of a weakness. Howard rode away looking uncertain. Morgan didn't blame him. What he was about to attempt violated every principle the Continental Army had been trying to drill into its soldiers since Valley Forge. But European tactics assumed European soldiers, men who'd been trained from childhood to stand in formation and die in place rather than break ranks. American militia weren't European soldiers. They were farmers who knew the value of their own lives, who understood that a dead man couldn't defend his family or work his land. Their tendency to retreat when things got desperate wasn't cowardice. It was rational self-preservation. Morgan had spent months studying not just Tarleton, but the men he himself commanded. He'd walked their campfires, shared their rations, listened to their stories. He knew what motivated them, what frightened them, what they could and couldn't be asked to do. Conventional commanders tried to make militia behave like regulars, then expressed shock when the amateur soldiers refused to stand and die in neat formations. Morgan was going to do something no American general had seriously attempted. He was going to use the militia exactly as they were, build his battle plan around their strengths instead of trying to overcome their weaknesses. But first he needed ground. The place was called Cow Pens, named for the cattle pens local farmers had built in the area before the war disrupted their trade. Morgan had passed through 2 weeks earlier during the retreat, noted its features, filed the information away against possible future need. The ground rose in gentle slopes, offering good fields of fire. Scattered trees provided concealment without creating impassable thickets. Most critically, the broad river curved behind it at a distance of about 5 miles, close enough to prevent retreat but far enough to avoid the immediate bank becoming a killing ground. They reached the site as afternoon shadows lengthened toward evening. The men spread out across the field, dropping packs, starting fires against the January cold. Pickets went out to watch the roads. Scouts disappeared into the gathering darkness to track Tarleton's approach, and Morgan called together the militia captains for the conversation that would determine whether his plan was brilliance or suicide. 40 men gathered around the fire, their faces showing every year of the hard winter campaign. These weren't professional officers with gilt braid and formal commissions. They were farmers who'd been elected to lead by neighbors who trusted them, shopkeepers who'd closed their stores to carry rifles, frontier preachers who saw the revolution as God's work against tyranny. Some had fought in a dozen actions. Others had never seen battle, their only military experience built from hunting squirrels and shooting at stumps. Morgan told them about Tarleton, not the myth, but the man. 26 years old, youngest son of a wealthy Liverpool merchant family grown rich on the slave trade. He'd purchased his commission the way British officers did, buying rank with family money. But unlike most aristocratic dilettantes, Tarleton had proven himself a natural military talent, aggressive, decisive, willing to take risks that paid off more often than not. He'd built the British Legion from scratch, recruiting loyalist Americans who knew the country and combining them with British regulars to create a fast-moving strike force that could cover 60 miles in a day. But talent wasn't the same as wisdom. Success bred overconfidence. And overconfidence made men predictable. Tarleton fought the same way every time. Lightning advance, immediate assault, overwhelming force concentrated at the point of contact. He didn't scout carefully, didn't probe for weaknesses, didn't consider that his enemies might be doing anything except running in terror. He saw American militia break and flee a dozen times, so he assumed they'd always break and flee. He pursued defeated enemies without mercy, so he assumed that anyone retreating must be defeated. Morgan was going to use all of that against him. The battle plan emerged in the firelight, drawn with a stick in the dirt, marked with stones and broken branches. 3 lines of defense, each with a specific role, each positioned to exploit both American strengths and British assumptions. The first line would stand 150 yards forward of the main position. Militia sharpshooters, men with hunting rifles accurate to 200 yards, far superior to the smooth-bore muskets British soldiers carried. Their job wasn't to stop the British advance, it was to hurt it, to kill officers and sergeants, to create gaps in the enemy formations. And then, after firing 2 volleys, they would retreat. Not run in panic, but conduct an organized withdrawal to pre-planned positions in the woods on either flank. Morgan looked at the faces around the fire, seeing the understanding dawn. He wasn't asking them to stand and die. He was asking them to shoot straight, follow orders, and then get out of the way, that they could do. That played to skills they already possessed from years of hunting in dense forests where a missed shot meant going hungry. The second line, positioned 150 yards behind the first, would consist of more experienced militia under Pickens' direct command. Their role was to slow the British advance with disciplined volley fire, make the enemy pay for every yard gained, and then fall back to reform on the flanks of the third line. Not run away, fall back. There was a difference, and Morgan emphasized it with words that left no room for misunderstanding. This wasn't defeat, this was tactics. The third line, the anchor of the entire position, would hold the low rise that dominated the battlefield. Howard's Continentals, 300 veterans who knew how to load and fire in disciplined volleys, who understood bayonet drill, who'd proven at Monmouth and Germantown that they could trade blows with British regulars and give better than they got. They'd absorbed the main British assault after it had been weakened and disrupted by the first 2 lines. And when Tarleton's forces were fully committed, strung out and disordered from chasing what they thought were fleeing Americans, Washington's cavalry would hit them from behind. One of the militia captains, a lean man named Candler who'd survived Waxhaws, spoke the question Morgan knew they were all thinking. What if the first line actually broke? What if fear took over and men ran for real? Not the controlled retreat Morgan described, but genuine panic? The old wagoner met Candler's eyes across the fire. The scars on his back pulled tight as he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a register that made every man strain to hear. He didn't expect them to fight like Continental regulars. He didn't expect them to die standing in place like British soldiers trained from childhood to endure discipline through fear. He expected them to be what they were, Americans who valued their lives but valued their liberty more. Who knew when to stand and when to move, when to press and when to fall back? Who understood that battles weren't won by blind obedience but by men choosing to do the difficult thing because they trusted the man who asked it of them? The words hung in the cold air. Around the fire, men exchanged glances, weighing what they'd heard against what they'd experienced in months of losing. Morgan could see the calculation in their faces, the slow shift from doubt to something that might, with luck, become belief. Pickens asked about the river at their backs. Every military manual warned against fighting with a major obstacle behind you. It cut off retreat, turned withdrawal into rout, left a defeated army with nowhere to go but into captivity or death. Morgan's answer came flat and unyielding. That was exactly the point. He wanted his men to know retreat was impossible, that the only way out was through. Sometimes when men couldn't run, they discovered depths of courage they didn't know they possessed. And sometimes when the enemy thought you were trapped and desperate, they made mistakes born of overconfidence. The meeting broke up as full darkness settled over the camp. Captains returned to their companies to explain the plan, to mark out positions, to ensure every man understood his role. Morgan stayed by the fire, feeling the warmth do nothing to ease the pain radiating from his joints. Anderson brought coffee, such as it was, boiled acorns and chicory that bore only passing resemblance to the real thing. He drank it anyway, grateful for the heat, if not the taste. Howard appeared out of the darkness, his face troubled. The Continental officer positioned himself where the firelight illuminated his features. Nothing hidden, no games of rank or protocol. His words came direct. He trusted Morgan's tactical judgment, had seen enough of the old wagoner's work to know there was method behind apparent madness. But this plan required perfect timing and coordination. If any element failed, if the militia broke for real, if Washington's cavalry couldn't get into position, if the Continentals couldn't hold long enough, the entire army would be destroyed. Morgan felt a smile tug at the corner of his mouth despite the circumstances. He'd been in the military since the French and Indian War, 25 years of carrying a musket or commanding men who did. He'd seen Braddock's column destroyed on the Monongahela, watched British regulars march into French and Indian ambushes because their commanders couldn't imagine fighting any way except in formation. He'd survived the disaster at Quebec, the retreat from Montreal, the desperate defense at Saratoga, where his riflemen had turned the tide by doing what regular soldiers insisted was impossible. Every victory he'd ever won had involved doing something the enemy thought couldn't be done, breaking rules the manuals insisted were inviolable, trusting American soldiers to use their judgment instead of blindly following orders. This time wouldn't be different, just more desperate. Howard nodded slowly and withdrew. Morgan sat alone by the fire, feeling the accumulated fatigue of weeks spent running pressed down on his shoulders like a physical weight. His back screamed. His hip had seized up entirely. When he finally stood to make his rounds of the camp, the first steps brought tears to his eyes that he blinked away before anyone could notice. He walked the picket lines, checking positions, speaking with sentries. Moved through the camp proper, stopping at fires where men huddled against the cold. No long speeches, no heroic exhortations, just quiet conversations with soldiers who tomorrow might die because he'd chosen to make a stand instead of crossing the river to safety. At one fire sat a boy who couldn't have been more than 16, hands wrapped around a tin cup, rifle propped against his shoulder. Thomas Young, someone said his name was. First real action. The boy's eyes were wide in the firelight, fear written plain across his features. Morgan lowered himself carefully to sit beside the boy, joints protesting every inch of the movement. The question came gentle. Was the boy scared? Young nodded, not bothering to hide it. Yes, sir. Terrified, if he was being honest. The old wagoner's voice carried approval rather than censure. Good. Meant he wasn't stupid. Meant he understood what was coming. Fear was natural, human, nothing to be ashamed of. The trick was doing your job despite being scared, not because you weren't. They sat in silence for a while, watching the fire burn down to coals. Finally, Morgan stood, the movement taking twice as long as sitting had, every muscle and joint filing formal complaints. He looked down at Thomas Young and offered the only comfort he had. Tomorrow would be hard, possibly the hardest thing the boy ever did. But he wouldn't be alone. The men around him, the officers above him, they'd all be just as scared, just as uncertain. They'd do their jobs anyway. The boy nodded, some of the naked terror easing from his features. Morgan moved on to the next fire, the next group of men, repeating variations of the same conversation, building trust one soldier at a time. Near midnight, he found Old Man Henderson, a leathery veteran in his 50s, who'd survived Waxhaws by playing dead under a pile of corpses while Tarleton's Legion butchered the wounded. The man's hands shook even when he wasn't holding anything, trauma written into his nervous system. But he'd stayed with the army, refused to go home, driven by hatred of the man who'd ordered that massacre. Henderson's voice came rough, damaged by screaming he must have done while pretending to be dead. He'd seen what Tarleton did to men who surrendered. He wouldn't be taken alive. Would rather die fighting than end up on his knees begging for mercy that wouldn't come. Morgan understood the sentiment, but couldn't allow it to spread. Hatred made men reckless, turned calculated risk into suicide. He needed Henderson focused on the mission, not on revenge. The words came carefully measured. Tomorrow they'd give Tarleton something he'd never experienced. They'd beat him, not just survive, not just escape, but actually defeat his legion, take his prisoners, capture his colors. But that required discipline, required following the plan even when everything looked like it was falling apart. Could Henderson do that? Could he trust Morgan's judgment even when his own rage wanted to charge straight at British bayonets? The old survivor was quiet for a long time, the firelight casting shifting shadows across his scarred features. Finally he nodded. He'd follow orders. Do his part. But after, if any of those green-coated bastards fell into his hands, Morgan had better not expect mercy. Fair enough. Morgan moved on. The Virginia riflemen had their own fire, a close-knit group who'd fought together since the war's beginning. These were the men who'd marched to Boston in 1775, who'd hidden in trees at Saratoga, and shot British officers at ranges the enemy insisted were impossible. They didn't need motivation or reassurance. They needed targets. Their sergeant, a man named Murphy who claimed to have personally killed General Fraser at Saratoga, though 3 other riflemen made the same claim, wanted to know where Morgan wanted them positioned. First line, picking off officers. Second line, helping pickings. Or held in reserve for emergencies. First line. Absolutely first line. Morgan wanted British officers and sergeants dead before they closed to effective musket range. Wanted chaos in the enemy formations before the main assault even developed. Could they do that? Could they identify and eliminate leadership at 200 yards while British ranks advanced under fire? Murphy's grin showed teeth missing from years of hard campaign. They could do that in their sleep, had been doing it for 6 years. Tomorrow wouldn't be different except for the number of targets. Morgan left them to their preparations and sought his own bedroll. Sleep wouldn't come easy, not with pain radiating through his back and hips, not with the weight of tomorrow's decisions pressing down. But he'd learned long ago to take rest when he could. The body's needs didn't care about tactical concerns or strategic imperatives. He lay on his back, staring at stars visible between winter bare branches, and thought about Tarleton. The young British officer had everything Morgan had lacked at that age: wealth, education, family connections, formal military training. But Tarleton had never been flogged within an inch of his life, never learned what a man could endure when the alternative was accepting defeat, had never stood in a forest clearing with a ragtag group of militia and decided that this time, this place, would be where the running stopped. Somewhere to the south, perhaps 10 miles now, Tarleton's legion marched through the darkness. Morgan could picture it, the long column of green-coated cavalry and infantry, moving fast, pushing hard, eager for another easy victory over demoralized Americans. The British commander would be confident, certain that Morgan was still retreating, that contact would come at the moment of Tarleton's choosing. The old wagoner allowed himself a grim smile, despite the pain. By dawn, Tarleton would discover the Americans had stopped running, would find them deployed for battle, apparently trapped against the river, vulnerable and desperate. It would look like a gift, like Morgan had made a fatal mistake born of exhaustion and poor judgment. And Bloody Ban, flush with 15 straight victories, contemptuous of American tactical abilities, eager to add another triumph to his record, would attack immediately. No careful reconnaissance, no patient probing for weaknesses, just the same direct assault that had worked every time before. Morgan's last thought before sleep finally claimed him was a prayer that his body would hold together long enough to see the plan through. That pain wouldn't cloud his judgment at the critical moment, that the soldiers he'd asked to trust him wouldn't regret that trust. The dice were thrown. By this time tomorrow, he'd either be dead, captured, or the man who destroyed Tarleton's legion. Morning came cold and clear, frost coating the grass, breath fogging in air so sharp it hurt to inhale. Morgan woke to Anderson shaking his shoulder. the young aide's face apologetic. British scouts had been spotted at dawn, hanging back at the edge of vision, observing American positions. Tarleton knew where they were. Contact was imminent. The old wagoner sat up slowly, every joint screaming protest, back muscles spasming with the change in position. For a long moment he couldn't move, couldn't force his body to respond to mental commands. Then training and experience took over, pushing through the pain to something resembling functionality. He stood, braced himself against a tree while blood flow returned to legs that had gone numb, and began preparing for the last morning of Tarleton's winning streak. The British Legion appeared through morning mist like a vision from European battlefields transplanted to Carolina soil. Drums beat the advance, a rhythm that had conquered half the known world, that had broken French columns and scattered Spanish infantry across 100 fields. The sound carried across frozen grass, mechanical and inevitable, the heartbeat of an empire that had never lost in the Southern theater. Tarleton's cavalry came first, green coats bright against winter browns and grays, their horses moving at a disciplined trot that spoke of professional training. Behind them marched the infantry, red coats of the 7th Fusiliers forming neat ranks, muskets at the proper angle, officers mounted and conspicuous in their gold braid. The 71st Highlanders moved in reserve, their kilts and tall bearskin caps marking them as elite troops, whose reputation extended from Scotland to the furthest reaches of British America. Morgan watched from the low rise where Howard's Continentals waited in their third-line position. His telescope brought the enemy into sharp focus, close enough to see individual faces, to read the confidence in Tarleton's posture as the young commander surveyed the American deployment from horseback. The British officer sat straight in his saddle, one hand on his reins, the other resting casually on his sword hilt. A man who'd won 15 consecutive engagements and saw no reason the 16th would be different. The old wagoner collapsed the telescope and handed it to Anderson. His back had loosened slightly with movement, the initial morning agony settling into merely constant pain, functional pain, the kind he could work through if he had to. Below and in front of his position, the first line of militia waited in scattered formation among the trees. 150 sharpshooters with hunting rifles, positioned to appear nervous and disorganized. It wasn't entirely an act. Morgan could see hands gripping rifle stocks too tight, men shifting weight from foot to foot, heads turning to mark the distance back to the second line. Young Thomas was down there somewhere, probably terrified, probably wondering if he'd live to see another sunset. Pickens commanded the second line. 300 militia formed in better order, waiting 150 yards behind the first. These men had fought before, knew what was coming, understood their role. But understanding didn't make it easier, didn't stop the churning in stomachs as British drums grew louder, as the distance closed yard by inevitable yard. Washington's cavalry remained hidden behind the rise, out of sight from British scouts, 80 mounted men who represented the entire striking power of Morgan's reserve. If they revealed themselves too early, if Tarleton spotted them and adjusted his deployment, the entire plan collapsed. Washington had orders to wait, to remain concealed no matter what happened in front of him, until Morgan sent the signal. "What signal?" the cavalry commander had asked. "You'll know," Morgan had told him, "because the entire British army would be chasing what they thought was a beaten enemy straight into a killing ground." Tarleton deployed his forces with the speed of a commander who saw no need for caution. The 7th Fusiliers formed the center of his line, 2 ranks deep, professional soldiers whose drill was so ingrained they could load and fire 3 volleys a minute while under fire themselves. British Legion infantry anchored the left wing, loyalist Americans who fought with the converts' zeal, eager to prove their loyalty to the crown. On the right flank, the 17th Light Dragoons positioned themselves to prevent any American attempt to escape in that direction, their horses restless, sensing the tension. 2 small field pieces, 3-pounder cannons called grasshoppers for their ability to be moved quickly across rough terrain, unlimbered in front of the infantry line. Their crews worked with practiced efficiency, swabbing barrels, loading charges, adjusting elevation. At this range, they could sweep the American positions with grape shot, turning canister into a horizontal storm of metal fragments that shredded human flesh. The 71st Highlanders remained in reserve, a deliberate choice that spoke to Tarleton's tactical assumptions. He expected the militia to break quickly, expected the Continentals to require more serious attention. The Highlanders would be his hammer, held back to deliver the killing blow once American resistance began to crumble. Morgan studied the deployment and felt grim satisfaction. Tarleton was doing exactly what he'd predicted, fighting exactly the way he'd won every previous engagement. Immediate assault, overwhelming force at the point of contact, reserves positioned to exploit breakthrough. Textbook European tactics that had crushed American forces from Charleston to Camden to Fishing Creek. But this time the Americans weren't trying to fight like Europeans. The grasshoppers fired, smoke and flame belching from their barrels, the concussion rolling across the field like physical force. Grapeshot tore through branches above the first-line militia, showering men with wooden fragments, but the elevation was slightly high. Most of the shot passed overhead, lethal intent wasted on empty air. Tarleton raised his sword. The gesture was theatrical, visible across the entire battlefield, meant to inspire his own men and intimidate his enemies. The drums beat faster, switching from march tempo to attack rhythm. The British line surged forward, moving from organized walk to determined advance, closing the distance at a pace designed to maximize psychological pressure on defending forces. 300 yards, 250, 200. Morgan could see individual faces now without the telescope. Young soldiers, older veterans, officers on horseback trying to maintain alignment as the line moved across uneven ground. The professionalism was evident in every step, the product of months or years of drill, of training that beat tactics into muscle memory until men could execute complex maneuvers under fire without conscious thought. But professional didn't mean invincible, and confidence could become a weapon when properly exploited. At 175 yards, Murphy's riflemen opened fire. The hunting rifles cracked in irregular sequence, not the organized volley of military muskets, but the aimed shots of men who'd learned marksmanship, hunting game, in dense forests. The sound was sharper than musket fire, the long rifles producing a distinctive report that carried across the field. A British lieutenant spun from his saddle, chest blooming red, his horse rearing in panic. A sergeant in the 7th Fusiliers clutched his throat, went down between the ranks, was trampled by men behind him who couldn't break stride. An officer of the British Legion jerked backward as if struck by an invisible fist, the musket ball entering just below his left eye. The American sharpshooters were targeting leadership with deliberate precision, aiming for the gold braid and mounted officers that marked command positions. Every man who fell created a gap in the British chain of authority, forced junior officers to make decisions they hadn't been trained for, introduced microseconds of hesitation into a military machine that relied on instant response to orders. The British line absorbed the casualties and continued advancing. Men stepped over fallen comrades, sergeants dressed the ranks, junior officers assumed command of sections whose leaders had been killed. The training held. The discipline held. These were professional soldiers who'd faced worse fire in European campaigns, who'd been taught from enlistment that advancing under fire was simply what infantry did. 150 yards. The distance closed despite losses. Morgan's first line reloaded with the speed of long practice, measuring powder, tamping balls, priming pans. 30 seconds for a trained man with a rifle, slightly faster for those who'd been doing it since childhood. The British advance gave them barely enough time. The second volley crashed out at 120 yards, more officers falling, more gaps appearing in the red-coated ranks. A captain of the 7th Fusiliers went down, his horse bolting sideways and disrupting an entire company's formation. 2 British Legion sergeants dropped within seconds of each other, leaving their sections leaderless at the critical moment when coordination mattered most. Then the American first line began to retreat. The movement looked exactly like what Tarleton expected to see. Militia who'd fired their weapons and now fled before British bayonets could reach them, falling back in groups that appeared disorganized, some men running faster than others, the appearance of discipline breaking down under pressure. Exactly what had happened at Camden, at Fishing Creek, At a dozen other engagements where American militia had fired a few shots and then scattered. But these men weren't scattering. They were moving along predetermined routes, angling toward the woods on either flank, rather than straight back toward the second line where they'd interfere with Pickens' fields of fire. The movement was planned, rehearsed in the hour before dawn, each man knowing exactly where to go and how fast to move. It looked like panic. It was choreography. Tarleton saw what he wanted to see. His sword slashed forward, urging his troops to press the attack, to chase the breaking militia before they could escape or regroup. The British line accelerated from advance to pursuit, formations beginning to loosen as individual soldiers and sections moved at slightly different speeds across uneven ground. The drums beat faster, officers shouted encouragement. The professional soldiers of the British Empire, victors of 15 southern engagements, drove forward after what appeared to be yet another collapsing American defense, and ran straight into Pickens' second line. The South Carolina militia had been waiting in good positions among scattered trees, using natural cover the way men did who'd hunted these woods since childhood. The British saw them too late, the distance already closed to 70 yards by the time Tarleton's forces registered the new threat. Pickens gave the order and 300 muskets fired in a single devastating volley. The range was close enough that even smoothbore weapons achieved brutal accuracy. British soldiers fell in groups, entire sections going down as musket balls found targets. The neat red-coated ranks developed holes, gaps where men had been standing a second before. Screams cut through the drum rhythm, the wounded crying out, the dying making sounds no training could prevent. But the British line held. Officers rallied their men, sergeants closed gaps, the formation tightened and continued forward. These weren't militia who could be intimidated by a single volley. These were professionals who'd faced French artillery at Minden, who'd stormed Spanish fortifications at Havana, who'd learned through harsh experience that the only way through hell was straight ahead. Pickens' men fired again, the second volley ragged but still effective at 60 yards. More British fell. More gaps appeared. The advance slowed but didn't stop, couldn't stop, because stopping under fire was how armies died. Then the second line began to fall back. Again, it looked like the classic militia collapse. Men who'd fired their weapons and now retreated before British bayonets could close the distance. Pickens shouted orders that appeared to be desperate attempts to maintain control, his officers trying to rally men who seemed determined to flee. But this retreat was as carefully managed as the first. The militiamen moved back through pre-scouted routes, maintaining loose order, heading toward positions on the flanks of the third line where they could reform and re-enter the battle. It wasn't flight, it was tactical repositioning. Tarleton didn't see the distinction. He saw American militia breaking for the second time, the pattern that had defined every Southern engagement repeating itself with mechanical predictability. His confidence, already high, soared into certainty. The Continentals on the hill would be next. Isolated after their militia support had evaporated, vulnerable to the overwhelming force of British regulars attacking with bayonets fixed. The British advance transformed into something approaching a charge, discipline fraying at the edges as soldiers smelled victory and pressed forward faster than their officers intended. The neat formations that had begun the attack were now stretched across the field, companies and sections separated by gaps, the careful alignment disrupted by pursuing fleeing enemies across uneven ground. Morgan watched from the rise and felt ice in his veins despite the moment approaching. The British were exactly where he needed them to be. Formations disrupted, officers killed, troops winded from advancing uphill while under fire. But the next part required his Continentals to absorb an assault from professional soldiers who still outnumbered them and whose blood was up with the scent of triumph. Howard's 300 Maryland and Delaware veterans stood in two ranks on the low rise, bayonets fixed, muskets loaded, waiting with the stillness of men who'd seen this before. These soldiers had survived Valley Forge, fought at Monmouth and Germantown, endured the defeats and celebrated the victories that had forged the Continental Army into something approaching a professional force. They knew what was coming, knew it would be brutal, accepted it because Morgan had asked them to, and because there was nowhere left to run anyway. The British assault hit at 80 yards, a ragged volley that sent musket balls humming through the Continental ranks. Men fell, the wounded crying out, the dead collapsing silently. The survivors dressed ranks automatically, closing gaps, maintaining the two-line formation that was doctrine for infantry combat. Howard's voice carried across the position, calm and professional, the tone of an officer who'd been in worse situations and lived to tell about it. Hold steady. Wait for the order. Pick your targets. 70 yards, 60. The distance closed with terrible inevitability. The Continentals fired their first volley at 50 yards, close enough that smoothbore muskets achieved devastating effect. The British front ranks staggered, men falling, the advance checking for the first time, but only for seconds. Sergeants pushed from behind, officers waved swords, and the professional soldiers of the 7th Fusiliers and British Legion Infantry surged forward again. The Continental second rank fired while the first rank reloaded, standard infantry tactics that kept constant pressure on attacking forces. More British fell, more gaps appeared, but the red-coated soldiers kept coming, driven by training and momentum and the knowledge that the only way to survive musket fire was to close with cold steel. 30 yards, 20. The distance where battles were decided by men's willingness to kill at arm's length. Howard ordered the bayonet charge before the British could deliver theirs. The Continentals surged down the slope, 300 men moving as a unit, bayonets extended, screaming challenges that were half rage and half terror transformed into aggression. The two forces met in a chaos that bore no resemblance to the ordered diagrams in military manuals. Men stabbed and clubbed with musket butts, grappled and fell, fought with the desperate savagery of soldiers who understood that hesitation meant death. The Continentals had the advantage of high ground and fresh legs. The British had the advantage of numbers and professional training that functioned even in the midst of hand-to-hand combat. For brutal minutes, the fighting swayed back and forth, neither side able to gain decisive advantage. Continental soldiers fell to British bayonets. British soldiers went down under American musket butts. Officers on both sides tried to maintain cohesion, to turn individual combats into organized assault, but the fog of close combat rendered commands meaningless beyond a few yards. Thomas Young found himself face to face with a British private who couldn't have been much older than he was, both of them fumbling to reload weapons with hands that shook from adrenaline and fear. The British soldier got his ramrod out first, Young's hands betraying him at the critical moment. He saw the enemy bayonet coming and threw himself sideways, felt the blade slice across his ribs, shallow but burning. Scrambled backward and found Henderson beside him, the old Waxhaws survivor clubbing the British soldier down with his musket butt, once, twice, continuing to strike long after the enemy had stopped moving. The boy grabbed Henderson's arm, physically restraining him, seeing the vacant look in the older man's eyes, the trauma of Waxhaws replaying itself in his mind. Not here, not now. They had to stay focused. The fighting continued for 15 minutes that felt like hours. The Continentals held their ground through sheer bloody-minded determination, refusing to break despite casualties, despite exhaustion, despite every tactical calculation suggesting they were outnumbered and should fall back. They held because Howard asked them to, and because Morgan's plan required them to hold, and because Continental soldiers had learned at Valley Forge that sometimes you endured simply because the alternative was unacceptable. Then Tarleton committed his reserve. The 71st Highlanders had been waiting for this moment, watching the assault develop, ready to be the hammer that broke American resistance. Their commander gave the order, and 200 Scottish soldiers advanced up the hill in perfect formation, pipes skirling, their reputation preceding them like a physical force. Howard saw them coming and felt his stomach tighten. His line was exhausted from the initial combat, ammunition running low, casualties mounting. The Highlanders were fresh, disciplined, elite troops whose battlefield prowess was legendary. If they hit his center in a coordinated assault, the Continental line would break not from cowardice, but from simple arithmetic. You couldn't hold against superior numbers forever. The tactical situation demanded a response, required adjusting the defensive formation to meet the new threat. Howard shouted orders to his rightmost companies, telling them to refuse the flank, to bend back the end of his line to create an angle that could deliver fire into the Highlanders as they advanced. The noise was incredible. Musket fire and screaming and drums and the peculiar sound of bayonets scraping against bone. Howard's orders were transmitted by junior officers who had to shout to be heard, who gestured with swords to make their meaning clear above the din. Captain Watts, commanding the rightmost company, heard the order wrong. In the chaos of combat, with smoke obscuring vision and sound distorted by hundreds of men packed into confined space, the distinction between refuse the flank and fall back became meaningless. Watts heard what he thought he heard and acted on it, ordering his company to withdraw, to move back from their position, to create space between themselves and the advancing Highlanders. The company next to Watts saw the withdrawal and assumed it was a general order they'd somehow missed. They began falling back as well, moving away from the British assault, creating gaps in the Continental line that spread like cracks in ice. Within 30 seconds, the entire Continental Third Line was conducting a fighting withdrawal, moving backward up the slope in loose order, still facing the enemy, but no longer anchored to their defensive position. To the British, it looked like the moment they'd been waiting for all morning. The vaunted Continental Regulars, the last American resistance, were finally breaking just like the militia before them. Tarleton, watching from his command position, felt triumph surge through him. The pattern was repeating itself perfectly. Militia fled, Continentals broke, British steel prevailed. 15 victories in a row, and now 16. His orders rang across the battlefield, amplified by subordinate officers, taken up by sergeants and corporals and private soldiers who tasted victory and wanted to finish it. Press forward, show no mercy, drive them into the river and end this rabble's resistance forever. The British lines surged up the hill in pursuit, formations completely dissolving now, individual soldiers and small groups racing to catch fleeing Americans before they could escape. The careful advance that had begun the battle degenerated into a mob. Professional discipline sacrificed to the excitement of pursuit. Sergeants unable to maintain control over men who saw defeated enemies and wanted to deliver the killing blow. Morgan watched his entire battle plan collapsing and felt a moment of absolute clarity cut through the pain in his back and the exhaustion of weeks spent retreating. The accidental withdrawal was actually perfect. He'd wanted the British disordered, formations broken, pursuit mentality overriding tactical caution, but he hadn't been entirely sure the militia retreats would be enough to generate that response. Now Howard's Continentals, the troops the British actually respected, were falling back in apparent defeat. Tarleton's soldiers were charging uphill in complete disarray, strung out across the field, gaps between units measured in dozens of yards. Officers unable to control men who thought they were chasing a beaten enemy. The old wagoner spurred his horse toward Howard, ignoring the protests from joints and back, moving through the withdrawing Continental line. He found the younger officer trying to restore order, shouting commands that couldn't be heard, attempting to transform chaos back into disciplined formation. Morgan's words cut through the noise. What the hell was Howard doing? The Maryland officer's face showed equal parts frustration and confusion. His men had misheard orders, started withdrawing. The mistake had spread before he could correct it. He was trying to stop the retreat, to turn them around, to restore the defensive line before complete disaster overtook them. Morgan grabbed Howard's arm, the gesture stopping the younger man mid-sentence. His voice came urgent but controlled, the tone of someone who'd seen an opportunity and knew exactly how to exploit it. Keep going. Keep the withdrawal organized, but keep moving back. Let the British think they'd broken through. Let them charge up this hill in complete disorder, exhausted and strung out and vulnerable. Because in about 30 seconds, Morgan was going to turn this accidental retreat into the most devastating counterattack of the entire war. Howard's expression shifted from alarm to comprehension, to something approaching awe. He wheeled his horse and began shouting new orders, transforming the chaotic withdrawal into something controlled, keeping his men moving backward, but maintaining loose formation, fighting withdrawal rather than rout. The Continentals fell back 50 yards, the British pursuing with increasing confidence, the distance between forces closing to 40 yards, then 30. Tarleton's soldiers were running now, scattered across the slope, officers far behind trying to catch up to men who'd outpaced their command structure. Morgan waited until the British were fully committed, until their momentum carried them too far forward to easily disengage. until the distance had closed to where his next move would be impossible to counter. Then he gave the order that Tarleton would remember for the rest of his life. Halt. About face. Fire. The command passed through the Continental ranks with shocking speed. 300 men stopped their withdrawal, turned on their heels in perfect drill book fashion, and found themselves facing British soldiers who were suddenly way too close, who'd expected fleeing enemies and instead found veterans, presenting a wall of loaded muskets at point-blank range. The volley crashed out at 30 yards, every musket finding targets in the packed mass of pursuing British soldiers. The effect was devastating, catastrophic, the kind of concentrated fire that shredded formations and broke armies. Men fell in groups, entire sections going down, the front ranks of the British pursuit collapsing like puppets with cut strings. Before the smoke cleared, Howard ordered the bayonet charge. The Continentals surged forward, 300 men moving as a disciplined unit, crashing into British forces that were reeling from the volley, disorganized from the pursuit, caught completely by surprise. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical. Soldiers who'd thought they were chasing defeated enemies suddenly found themselves fighting for survival against veterans who attacked with cold professional fury. The British line, such as it was, shattered. And then Pickens' militia returned to the battle. The South Carolina fighters had been regrouping in the woods on the American right flank, watching the combat develop, waiting for the moment Morgan had promised them. They'd done their job, fired their volleys, conducted their retreats exactly as ordered. Now they saw the Continental counterattack succeed, saw British forces reeling, and every man among them made the same calculation. This wasn't a time to hold back. This was a time to finish it. Pickens didn't even need to give orders. His militiamen surged out of the woods, 300 fresh fighters hitting the British left flank at the precise moment when Tarleton's forces were most vulnerable. They poured musket fire into the packed British ranks, then charged with bayonets and rifle butts, screaming challenges that combined rage at months of losing with triumph at finally winning. The British left collapsed. On the opposite flank, Murphy's riflemen and the first-line militia had reformed and were moving back into combat, drawn by the same instinct that had motivated Pickens' men. They'd retreated as ordered, but retreat was finished now. Time to fight. Time to win. They hit the British right flank, completing the envelopment, surrounding Tarleton's forces on three sides. The Redcoats tried to form square, the standard defensive formation against cavalry or flanking attacks, but they didn't have time or space or sufficient leadership. Too many officers were dead, too many sergeants down, too much confusion and too many threats coming from too many directions at once. And then William Washington's cavalry crested the hill. 80 mounted dragoons had been waiting behind the rise for 40 minutes, listening to the battle develop, watching wounded men stumble past, hearing the crescendo of musket fire and screaming that marked a close combat. Washington had held them in position despite every instinct screaming to commit them early, trusting Morgan's judgment, waiting for the signal the old wagoner had promised. The signal was unmistakable. The entire British army was focused forward, engaged in desperate fighting with American forces that had them surrounded on three sides. Their backs were exposed, their formations destroyed, their command structure shattered. Washington drew his saber and pointed downhill. His dragoons followed, 80 horses accelerating from walk to trot to canter to full gallop, covering the distance to the British rear in seconds that felt eternal. The sound of hooves on frozen ground rolled across the battlefield like thunder. British soldiers, hearing it, turned and saw a nightmare approaching. Heavy cavalry at full charge, sabers out, bearing down on men who had no time to form square, no way to present an effective defense against mounted assault. The impact was physical and psychological. Horses crashed into the packed British ranks, scattering men, trampling those who fell. Sabers rose and fell, ugly close work that left soldiers screaming and bleeding. Washington himself engaged a British Legion officer in a brief, savage duel, sabers clashing, horses wheeling, until the American's blade found the gap between helmet and gorget, and the enemy officer went down. Tarleton's British Legion cavalry tried to intervene, 50 riders attempting to protect their infantry from Washington's assault. The two forces met in a thunder of colliding horses and ringing steel, dragoons and legionnaires fighting at arm's length with sabers and pistols in pure desperation. Tarleton himself was in the thick of it, his saber broken from an earlier clash, his horse wounded, blood streaking his green coat from a dozen minor cuts. He fought with the fury of a man watching his entire reputation collapse around him, trying to rally forces that no longer responded to commands, attempting to create order from chaos that had passed beyond any officer's control. His adjutant went down beside him, killed by a Continental saber. A British Legion lieutenant tried to protect Tarleton's flank and was shot from his saddle by one of Washington's dragoons. The young British commander found himself surrounded by American cavalry, hemmed in, facing capture or death. He chose flight. The decision wasn't cowardice, couldn't be characterized as panic. It was cold tactical calculation. His command was destroyed, his infantry surrounded and surrendering, his cavalry scattered. Staying would achieve nothing except his own capture. If he could escape, could reach Cornwallis with word of this disaster, perhaps something could be salvaged from the wreckage. Tarleton spurred his wounded horse through a gap in the American line, 30 surviving Legion cavalry following, breaking through Washington's dragoons through speed and desperation. The American cavalry tried to pursue but were too engaged with the remaining British forces to give effective chase. Bloody Band fled the field of cowpens, leaving behind his entire command, his artillery, his reputation, and the myth of British invincibility in the Southern Theater. On the battlefield, white flags began appearing among the surrounded British infantry. Men threw down muskets, raised hands, shouted surrender. The 7th Fusiliers, professional soldiers who'd fought in a dozen campaigns, laid down their arms. The British Legion infantry, loyalist Americans who'd believed the crown would protect them, surrendered to neighbors who'd been their enemies. The 71st Highlanders, caught between Washington's dragoons hammering from behind and Howard's Continentals pressing from the front, attempted to form square, but the chaos was too complete. Their officers shouted commands that couldn't be heard above the din. Within minutes, their distinctive bearskin caps lay scattered across the frozen grass as the proud Scottish regiment laid down arms in groups, their surrender marking the final collapse of Tarleton's elite force. Henderson found himself standing over a British soldier who couldn't have been more than 18. The boy's hands raised, tears streaming down his face, begging for mercy in an accent that spoke of London slums and poverty that made American frontier life look comfortable by comparison. The old Waxhaw survivor raised his bayonet, seeing in this terrified boy every Legion trooper who'd ignored surrender at that earlier massacre. His hands shook, not from age but from trauma and rage and the overwhelming desire to make them pay. Thomas Young grabbed his arm again, physically holding him back, the 16-year-old boy finding reserves of courage he didn't know he possessed. Not like them. Morgan had said they weren't like Tarleton's Legion, wouldn't become the monsters they'd been fighting. Henderson's eyes refocused slowly, the vacant look fading, the present reasserting itself over memory. He lowered the bayonet, stepped back, turned away from the surrendering British soldier without another word. Morgan rode through the carnage, his back screaming with every movement, feeling like his spine might separate entirely from the effort of staying upright in the saddle. Around him lay the evidence of what they'd accomplished. British soldiers dead and wounded scattered across the slope, equipment abandoned in flight, 2 Grasshopper field pieces sitting intact, their crews either dead or captured. Regimental colors of the 7th Fusiliers and 71st Highlanders, the sacred banners that embodied unit pride and history, lying in the grass where their bearers had fallen. Over 500 British prisoners sat in groups under guard, stunned and disbelieving. Officers who'd begun the morning confident of easy victory now faced years in prison camps. Soldiers who'd thought themselves invincible discovered they were just men after all, vulnerable to bullets and blades and tactical brilliance that outmaneuvered their training. The butcher's bill was starting to come in, officers counting casualties, trying to establish who'd survived and who hadn't. British losses were catastrophic. 110 dead on the field, 200 wounded, 500 captured along with all their equipment. Of the 1,100 men Tarleton had led into battle, barely 200 had escaped, most of those the cavalry that had fled with their commander. American casualties stood at 12 killed, and 61 wounded. The disparity was so extreme it seemed impossible. The kind of lopsided victory that happened in propaganda, not in actual combat between professional armies, but it had happened, was still happening as British soldiers continued surrendering, as the reality of defeat settled over what remained of Tarleton's command. Howard found Morgan sitting his horse at the crest of the rise, looking out over the battlefield with an expression that mixed satisfaction with exhaustion and pain. The Maryland officer had a cut above his eye from a British musket ball that had come closer than he wanted to think about, blood drying on his face, but he was grinning despite the wound. His words came through the grin, mixing disbelief with triumph. They'd actually done it, pulled off what every military manual said was impossible, used militia as the primary force in a conventional battle, and won decisively. Morgan's response came quiet, meant only for Howard's ears. The Continentals had done it. The militia had done it. Pickens and Washington and Murphy and every soldier who trusted the plan, despite every instinct screaming to run. The victory belonged to them, not to some old wagoner whose back felt like it might snap if he dismounted too quickly. But Morgan knew, even if he wouldn't say it aloud, that this single hour on a Carolina hillside had changed everything. Tarleton's aura of invincibility was shattered. The British stranglehold on the South was broken. And most importantly, American soldiers now knew they could stand against professional European armies and not just survive, but triumph. The war wasn't over. Cornwallis still commanded a powerful force. The British still held Charleston and Savannah. The fighting would continue for months, perhaps years. But after Cowpens, it would be different. The hunters had become the hunted. And the empire that had never lost in the Southern theater had just learned that sometimes American farmers led by an aging frontiersman could outthink, outmaneuver, and utterly destroy the finest troops Britain could deploy. The aftermath revealed itself in frozen tableaus of violence. Corpses dotted the slope in positions that suggested their final moments. British redcoats and green-coated Legion soldiers mixed with a handful of Continental blue. The wounded made sounds that would haunt the survivors for years, calling for water, for mothers, for God, for death to come quickly and end what couldn't be endured. Prisoners sat in exhausted groups, many still processing the reality that they'd survived when so many hadn't, that they'd gone from victorious pursuit to complete surrender in minutes that felt disconnected from normal time. Morgan finally dismounted, the process taking twice as long as it should have, every muscle protesting, searing agony lancing through every vertebra as his boots touched frozen ground. Anderson moved to steady him, but the old wagoner waved him off, needing to stand on his own, needing his men to see him upright and functional, even if maintaining that illusion required every ounce of will he possessed. He walked among the prisoners, studying faces that ranged from teenage boys to grizzled veterans. Some met his gaze with defiance, professional soldiers who'd lost a battle but hadn't lost their pride. Others stared at nothing, shock written across features still processing defeat. A few wept openly, tears cutting tracks through powder-blackened faces, the emotional release of men who'd expected to die and discovered they'd live instead. A British officer, a captain of the 7th Fusiliers with his arm in a makeshift sling, struggled to his feet as Morgan approached. The gesture was automatic, ingrained by years of military protocol that functioned even in captivity. His uniform was torn, blood-stained, but he managed dignity despite circumstances that would have broken lesser men. The captain's words came stiff with both pain and professional courtesy. He wished to commend the American commander on a brilliant tactical victory. The maneuver with the lines, the coordinated retreat and counterattack, it was masterfully executed, worthy of study at any military academy in Europe. Morgan acknowledged the compliment with a nod, seeing in this officer something he recognized from his own experience, a professional soldier who understood the craft of war beyond simple nationalism, who could appreciate tactical excellence even in defeat. The old wagoner's response came without gloating or triumph, one military man to another. His men had fought well, followed orders, done their duty. They deserved quarter and would receive it. The captain's relief was visible, shoulders relaxing fractionally. He'd heard the stories about Waxhaws, feared that American forces might exact vengeance for Tarleton's massacre. Finding instead a commander who honored the conventions of civilized warfare seemed to lift a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. But not all the prisoners were so composed. A young British private, 17 at most, sat apart from his comrades, rocking slightly, hands clasped over his ears as if trying to block out sounds only he could hear. His uniform marked him as 71st Highlanders, one of the elite Scottish soldiers who'd been held in reserve until the final assault. He'd probably never seen combat before today, thrust directly into the worst kind of close quarters fighting for his first engagement. Thomas Young found himself drawn to the boy, recognizing something of his own terror reflected in those vacant eyes. The American militiaman lowered himself to sit beside the British private, saying nothing, just present. Two teenagers who'd survived their first real battle and didn't yet know how to process what that meant. Eventually, the British boy's hands lowered from his ears. His voice came small, hollowed out by trauma. He joined to help his family, the enlistment bounty enough to keep his parents' farm through winter. Thought soldiering would be marching and camping and maybe some distant fighting that felt more like sport than slaughter. Hadn't expected the reality of men dying within arm's reach, blood hot and sticky, screaming that sounded like animals being butchered. Thomas understood completely. His own reasons for joining the militia felt distant now, abstractions about liberty and independence that seemed meaningless compared to the immediate reality of violence and death. But the fight had been necessary. Stopping Tarleton mattered more than their fear or revulsion. Sometimes doing the right thing required becoming someone you didn't recognize. The British boy nodded slowly, not agreement, but acknowledgement that they'd both crossed a threshold that morning, left behind whatever innocence they'd carried into the fight. Across the battlefield, officers were organizing the captured equipment into inventory. Two 3-pounder grasshopper cannons, intact and serviceable, would be invaluable additions to American artillery that was perpetually short of field pieces. 800 British muskets, most in good condition, would arm militia companies that had been fighting with hunting rifles and obsolete firearms. 100 cavalry horses, 35 supply wagons, equipment and ammunition that represented months of British logistics. But the real prizes were the colors. Regimental flags embodied unit history and pride, carried into battle as rallying points and symbols of collective identity. Soldiers were trained to die defending their colors, to never let them fall into enemy hands because their loss meant dishonor that stained not just the current soldiers, but every man who'd ever served under those banners. The 7th Royal Fusiliers and the 71st Highland Regiment had lost their colors at Cowpens, the silk flags now in American hands, physical proof of total defeat. Howard supervised their collection personally, ensuring they were treated with the respect such symbols deserved even in victory. These weren't mere trophies. They were evidence that British forces could be beaten decisively, that the aura of professional superiority surrounding European armies was myth rather than reality. The captured British surgeon, a competent-looking man in his 40s, whose coat was already blood-spattered from treating wounded, approached Morgan with a request that bordered on demand. He needed assistance caring for the injured, needed supplies and space and hands to help with the overwhelming number of casualties, British wounded and American wounded both, because a surgeon's oath transcended national allegiance. Morgan granted the request immediately, ordering Continental medical personnel to work alongside their British counterpart, sending men to gather supplies from captured wagons, designating a barn half a mile distant as field hospital. The wounded deserved care regardless of which uniform they wore. That was civilization, the thing that separated soldiers from murderers. But even as he gave orders, Morgan felt his body beginning to fail in ways that couldn't be ignored much longer. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the battle was draining away, leaving behind pain so intense it threatened to buckle his knees. His vision blurred at the edges, gray closing in from periphery toward center. He'd pushed himself beyond reasonable limits, and his body was submitting a formal complaint that could no longer be dismissed. Anderson caught him as he started to collapse, the young aide calling for help, easing the old wagoner to the ground with as much dignity as circumstances allowed. Morgan's consciousness flickered, present, then absent, then present again. Awareness coming in fragments that didn't quite connect to form coherent understanding. Howard was there, his face concerned, asking questions Morgan couldn't quite process. Washington arrived dismounted, his cavalry commander's uniform torn and blood-spattered from the melee with Tarleton's legion. Pickens appeared, the Presbyterian elder's expression mixing triumph with worry as he looked down at the man whose tactical genius had delivered victory. The old wagoner's words came weak but clear enough. His officers needed to organize the withdrawal. Tarleton had escaped, would reach Cornwallis within a day or two, and the British commander would respond to this disaster with everything he had. American forces needed to move, to get the prisoners and captured equipment away from this field before British reinforcements could arrive. And they needed to send word to Greene. The Southern commander had to know what happened here, had to understand that his gamble in dividing forces had paid off beyond anyone's reasonable expectations. Howard assured him everything would be handled, orders were already being implemented, scouts dispatched, preparations underway. What Morgan needed to do now was rest, let the surgeon examine him, stop trying to command while his body was actively shutting down from exhaustion and pain. The old wagoner allowed himself to be helped to a wagon, permitted the indignity of being transported like cargo because fighting his body's limits wouldn't change them. As the wagon jolted into motion, every bump transmitted directly to his inflamed joints. He permitted himself the luxury of closing his eyes and acknowledging just how much this morning had cost him physically. But worth it. God help him, despite the pain, despite the dead scattered across the field, despite everything, it had been worth it. Tarleton reached Cornwallis 30 hours after fleeing Cowpens, his horse nearly dead beneath him. His remaining cavalry scattered across 20 miles of road, his uniform identifying him as an officer, but his appearance suggesting a man who'd survived disaster by the narrowest margin. The British commander received him in a plantation house that served as temporary headquarters, the room filled with senior officers who'd been planning the invasion of North Carolina. The news hit like physical assault. 1,100 men gone, entire regiments captured or destroyed, artillery lost, colors taken. The British Legion, Tarleton's personal command, effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Cornwallis listened to the account with a face that showed nothing, the perfect mask of an aristocratic officer who'd learned to control emotional display in service to the crown. Only when Tarleton finished, his voice hoarse from hard riding and the effort of delivering catastrophic news, did the British commander's composure crack slightly. His words came measured but carrying an edge that made experienced officers flinch. How had this happened? How had a force of 1,100 professional soldiers been destroyed by colonial militia and a scattered collection of continental regulars? How had Tarleton, victor of 15 consecutive engagements, managed to lose everything in a single morning? The young cavalry commander's defense came defensive, edged with the desperation of a man watching his reputation collapse. Morgan had tricked him, used unconventional tactics, violated accepted military principles, fought in ways that no European-trained officer would anticipate. The militia hadn't broken the way militia always broke. The Continentals had conducted that impossible counterattack. The terrain, the positioning, every factor had favored the Americans in ways that couldn't have been predicted. Cornwallis listened and saw through the excuses to the essential truth. Tarleton had been overconfident, contemptuous of American capabilities, careless in his tactical dispositions. He'd fought the same battle he'd won 15 times before and discovered too late that Morgan wasn't fighting that battle at all. The strategic implications were immediately clear to the British commander. His planned invasion of North Carolina was now impossible. He'd lost too much force, too many experienced soldiers, too much equipment. The psychological impact across the South would be devastating. Every patriot militia encouraged, every loyalist questioning whether British protection meant anything if the vaunted Legion could be destroyed so completely. Cornwallis made his decision with the ruthless clarity that had made him one of Britain's most successful commanders. He would abandon the Carolina invasion and pursue Morgan's force instead, seek to destroy the American column before they could escape with their prisoners and captured equipment. If he could catch them, force a battle on his terms, he might salvage something from this disaster. The decision would lead eventually to Yorktown. To a British army exhausted by chasing Greene and Morgan across the Carolinas, worn down by constant harassment, depleted by disease and desertion, finally trapped on a Virginia peninsula with nowhere left to run. But that was 9 months in the future. At this moment, Cornwallis saw only the immediate necessity of responding to catastrophe with aggressive action. Tarleton remained standing as other officers filed out to implement their commander's orders. His career was effectively over, his reputation destroyed, his future in military service questionable at best. The man who'd built a fearsome legend through 15 Southern victories would forever be remembered for the 16th battle, the one where an aging frontiersman with mixed forces had made him look like an amateur. News of cowpens spread through the South like wildfire through dry timber. Patriot militias that had been on the verge of dissolving suddenly found new recruits. Men who'd hidden in swamps or fled to the mountains returned to their companies with renewed belief that British forces could be beaten. Loyalists who'd openly supported the crown began hedging their positions, wondering if backing the losing side might prove fatal to more than their political prospects. A messenger reached Greene 4 days after the battle, the rider nearly killing his horse to deliver news that seemed too good to believe. 500 British prisoners, 2 field pieces captured, regimental colors taken, Tarleton's legion destroyed, American casualties minimal, a tactical masterpiece that military theorists would study for generations. Greene read the dispatch 3 times, certain he must be misunderstanding something, that the numbers had to be exaggerated or the situation misreported. Then he called his staff officers together and read it aloud, watching disbelief transform into comprehension and then into wild celebration. His own words, written in hasty response to Morgan, captured the moment's significance better than any formal military report could. The old wagoner had saved the South, turned despair into hope, proven that unconventional tactics and trust in common soldiers could defeat European military might. But Greene also understood the danger. Cornwallis would respond with fury, would chase Morgan's column with everything he had, would seek to destroy the American force before they could escape with their prizes. The Southern campaign was entering a new phase, one where British forces would be driven by desperate need to recover their reputation rather than confident expansion of control. He dispatched orders for Morgan to move north immediately to avoid contact with Cornwallis' main force, to get the prisoners and equipment to safety before the British could intercept them. And he began planning his own movements, calculating how to use the victory at Cowpens to maximum strategic advantage, how to turn tactical success into operational opportunity. The war in the South had fundamentally changed in a single January morning. The British were no longer unstoppable conquerors. They were an army that had tasted significant defeat, that understood American forces could destroy their best units through tactical innovation and battlefield courage. Morgan's column moved north through the Carolinas, escorting 500 prisoners and wagon trains of captured equipment, racing to stay ahead of Cornwallis' pursuit. The old wagoner spent most of the march in a wagon himself, his body having finally submitted a refusal to continue that couldn't be overridden by will or necessity. His officers managed the withdrawal while he lay on straw bedding, feeling every jolt and jar transmitted directly to joints that screamed protest at continued abuse. At one stop, Howard came to report progress and found Morgan conscious enough for conversation. The Maryland officer's news was cautiously optimistic. They were maintaining distance from British forces, the prisoners were cooperative, equipment was being preserved despite harsh conditions. But Howard's real question was more personal. What would Morgan do after this? The victory at Cowpens had made him famous overnight, the kind of military hero that politicians and newspapers would celebrate. He could write his own orders, command whatever force he wanted, play a role in winning the war that his tactical brilliance had helped make possible. The old wagoner's response came quiet, already knowing the answer, even if saying it aloud hurt in ways different from physical pain. He was done. His body was broken beyond the point where duty could demand further service. After they reached safety, after the prisoners were secured and the equipment distributed, he would resign his commission and go home to Virginia. Let younger men with functioning spines finish what had been started, Howard protested, offering arguments about Morgan's value, his experience, the inspiration his presence provided to soldiers who'd seen him achieve the impossible. But the protest died when he saw the old wagoner's face, saw the exhaustion and pain written so deeply that no amount of will could mask them. Morgan had given everything he had to give. Cowpens was his last gift to the revolution, the final masterpiece of a military career that had begun when he was 20 years old and received 499 lashes for striking a British officer. He'd survived those lashes, carried the scars for 24 years, and finally delivered vengeance in the form of tactical brilliance that destroyed Britain's most feared Southern commander. It was enough, more than enough. Time to let others carry the burden. The column reached safety in North Carolina, passed the prisoners to Continental authorities, distributed the captured weapons and equipment to units that desperately needed them. The regimental colors went to Congress, where they were displayed as proof that American forces could achieve decisive victories against professional European armies. Morgan submitted his resignation and received Greene's reluctant acceptance. The Southern commander wrote that losing Morgan's tactical genius was a blow the Continental Army could ill afford, but that no one could question a man who'd given so much, demanding the right to go home and heal. The old wagoner traveled back to Virginia in the spring of 1781, reaching his modest farm in the Shenandoah Valley as the world turned green and new. His neighbors greeted him as a hero, wanted to hear stories of the battle, pressed him for details about how he defeated Bloody Ban Tarleton. Morgan gave them abbreviated versions, uncomfortable with celebration, unwilling to turn violence and death into entertaining narrative. He'd done his duty, followed orders, led men who trusted him and deserved that trust. The victory belonged to them, not to some aging wagoner whose body was already failing at 44. But alone, working his fields at a pace his damaged body could manage, he allowed himself to acknowledge what Cowpens had meant. Not just the tactical victory, though that was significant. Not just the captured equipment and prisoners, though those mattered strategically, but the proof that American soldiers, led well and trusted to use their judgment, could outfight the finest troops Europe could deploy. The revolution had been founded on ideas about liberty and self-governance, abstractions that sometimes seem disconnected from the reality of men killing each other in frozen fields. But Cowpens demonstrated that those ideas had military application, that armies organized around trust rather than fear, around flexibility rather than rigid doctrine, around respect for common soldiers rather than aristocratic command structures, could achieve victories that conventional forces thought impossible. That was the real legacy, more important than captured colors or destroyed regiments. The knowledge that Americans could fight differently and win, could break rules and triumph, could trust each other and achieve what drill manuals insisted was impossible. Thomas Young returned to South Carolina after the war, married, raised children, lived to old age watching the nation he'd helped create grow beyond anything his 16-year-old self could have imagined. He wrote his memoirs at 80, remembering Cowpens with clarity that surprised him, the details sharp despite intervening decades. His account included the moment when Henderson had held that bayonet over the surrendering British boy, the trauma of Waxhaw's replaying itself, the choice between vengeance and mercy hanging in frozen air. Young had grabbed the older man's arm, stopped him from becoming what they'd been fighting against. That moment, more than the battle itself, defined what Cowpens had meant to him. They weren't fighting to become like Tarleton, to match British ruthlessness with American cruelty. They were fighting to be better, to prove that liberty wasn't just abstract philosophy, but a practical organizing principle that produced different kinds of soldiers and different kinds of victories. Henderson survived the war as well, though he never fully recovered from Waxhaws. The trauma stayed with him, manifesting in nightmares and sudden episodes where present dissolved into past. But he'd stopped himself that day at Cowpens, chosen mercy despite everything in him, screaming for revenge. It wasn't much, measured against what he'd endured, but it was something, a small victory over the worst parts of himself. Howard continued fighting through the remainder of the war, distinguished himself in subsequent engagements, eventually became governor of Maryland. He never forgot the moment at Cowpens when his accidental withdrawal had nearly destroyed Morgan's entire plan. The seconds of pure terror when victory balanced on a knife edge before transforming into triumph. Leadership, he learned, wasn't about never making mistakes. It was about recovering from mistakes quickly enough that they became opportunities instead of disasters. Washington's cavalry commander survived a serious wound at Utah Springs, married a South Carolina woman after the war, named his firstborn son Morgan Washington in honor of the old wagoner who taught him that sometimes the boldest action was waiting, that holding reserves until the perfect moment required more courage than charging immediately. Pickens returned to South Carolina and spent years negotiating treaties with Cherokee and Creek nations, applying lessons learned at Cowpens about trust and respect to diplomatic rather than military contexts. He'd seen what happened when commanders trusted their soldiers to do difficult things, when orders acknowledged reality rather than demanding the impossible. Those same principles worked in treaty negotiations, in building relationships with native peoples who'd been systematically betrayed by European colonizers. Cornwallis abandoned the Carolinas after months spent chasing Greene and Morgan, exhausted his army in the process, finally trapped himself at Yorktown where French naval forces cut off his escape, and Washington's combined army forced his surrender in October 1781. Historians would trace the path from Cowpens to Yorktown, showing how Morgan's tactical victory had strategic consequences that cascaded across 9 months to ultimately deliver American independence. Tarleton returned to England after the war, bitter and defensive, writing memoirs that blamed everyone except himself for the disaster at Cowpens. He claimed Morgan had fought unfairly, used uncivilized tactics, violated gentlemanly conventions of warfare. The accusations revealed more about Tarleton's assumptions than about Morgan's methods, exposed the arrogance that had led him to underestimate American tactical capabilities. But for the rest of his life, which extended into the 1830s, Tarleton was remembered primarily for Cowpens, not for his 15 victories, not for his aggressive cavalry tactics, not for the fearsome reputation he'd built across 2 years of Southern campaigning. He was remembered for the battle where Daniel Morgan made him look foolish, where American militia and Continental regulars had destroyed his legion through tactical brilliance that military academies studied for generations. Morgan lived until 1802, dying at 66 in his Virginia home, surrounded by family who'd heard the Cowpens story so many times they could recite it themselves. He never boasted about the victory, never leveraged it for political advantage, never wrote memoirs celebrating his tactical genius. When visitors pressed him for details, he deflected credit to the soldiers who'd followed orders, to the officers who'd executed their roles perfectly, to the militiamen who'd trusted him enough to retreat when every instinct screamed to run. His funeral drew hundreds, veterans traveling from across the South to honor the man who'd proven that American soldiers could beat British professionals through innovation and trust rather than trying to match European training and discipline. They buried him in the simple cemetery where frontier families had been interred for generations, his gravestone identifying him only as Brigadier General, Continental Army, with no mention of the battle that had made him famous. But the people who gathered at that grave knew what he'd done, knew that on a cold January morning in 1781, an aging wagoner with a broken body and an unbreakable will had pulled off the most audacious tactical victory in American military history, had trusted common soldiers to do extraordinary things, had turned apparent weaknesses into devastating strengths, had proven that sometimes the greatest victories come from doing what everyone insists is impossible. Cowpens National Battlefield was established in the 20th century, preserving the ground where Morgan's tactical masterpiece had unfolded. Park rangers explained the battle to visitors, walking them through the three-line defense, the coordinated retreats, the devastating counterattack, the cavalry charge that completed the encirclement. Military historians brought cadets to study the terrain, to understand how Morgan had used geography and psychology, and his deep knowledge of both his own soldiers and his enemy to achieve something textbooks said couldn't be done. The lessons extended beyond military tactics into realms of leadership and organizational theory. Understanding your team's actual capabilities rather than demanding they conform to idealized standards. Using natural strengths instead of forcing people into systems that don't fit. The principles Morgan demonstrated on that frozen hillside would be studied everywhere, from military academies to corporate boardrooms. Proof that great leadership transcends its original context. The battle demonstrated principles that transcended its specific historical moment. That innovation often requires breaking rules conventional wisdom treats as inviolable, that trust produces better outcomes than fear, that apparent weaknesses can become decisive advantages when properly leveraged, that sometimes the most brilliant strategy is accepting what your people actually are, rather than demanding they become something they're not. Morgan's victory also embodied specifically American military virtues that would characterize the nation's armed forces for centuries afterward. Tactical flexibility over rigid doctrine, initiative at every level rather than centralized command, respect for enlisted soldiers' judgment, willingness to experiment with unconventional methods, trust in citizen soldiers to rise to challenges when properly led. These weren't merely abstract principles. They were practical realities that Morgan had implemented on January 17, 1781, turning a ragtag collection of militia and continental regulars into the force that destroyed Tarleton's legion. And in doing so, he'd helped establish the military culture that would define American forces through two world wars, countless smaller conflicts, and into eras where technology transformed warfare beyond anything Morgan could have imagined. But at its core, Coupons remained a story about men facing impossible odds and choosing to stand anyway. About an old wagoner whose body was failing, but whose mind remained sharp enough to see opportunities where others saw only disaster. About militia who'd been dismissed as worthless learning, they could defeat professional soldiers through courage and discipline and trust in their commander. About continental regulars executing the most difficult infantry maneuver under fire because someone had asked them to, and they believed that person was worth trusting. About a cold morning when everything changed, when the hunters became the hunted, when an empire learned that invincibility was myth rather than reality, when American independence became not merely a dream to be hoped for, but an achievement to be completed. The old wagoner would have dismissed such grand language as unnecessary. He'd just done his job, led his men as well as he knew how, tried to honor the trust they'd placed in him. That it happened to change the course of a war and help establish a nation was consequence, not intention. But consequences matter. And on January 17, 1781, Daniel Morgan's tactical brilliance at Cowpens delivered consequences that echoed across centuries, establishing principles and patterns that would define American military culture long after the last veteran of that frozen battlefield had passed into memory. Not bad for an old wagoner who'd learned his trade hauling supplies through frontier wilderness, who'd survived 499 lashes to deliver vengeance in the form of tactical genius, who'd proven one final time that sometimes the most dangerous opponent isn't the one with the best training or equipment, but the one who refuses to fight the way you expect.